Well, it was about 11:30 at night, and my wife Kathy had gone to bed, and I was alone in the lounge room in tears. Now, I was crying, and I was surprised at this because I was thinking, this is not the way it's supposed to be. This is not what's supposed to be happening. I know what's going to happen. I know what this scene is about, but it's so moving. And Sophie, the young woman, policewoman, has just been reunited with her grandma. When she's a little girl, her parents were killed, and she'd thought that her grandma and brother had been killed as well, but she's just been reunited with her brother, and now she's being reunited with her grandma, and I was in tears. The Da Vinci Code is a good yarn. I know there's some intellectual snobs out there who look down on it, but the book, the movie, it taps in at lots of levels. It's well written, it's fast-paced, there's surprising turns of plot, just when I thought I had things figured out. Good murder mystery, tantalising snippets of history, our deep sense of what people value. It's about the feminine, it's sensitive, it's gentle. The hint of romance, just the hint. I spent the whole novel wanting Robert and Sophie to end up getting it together. There's the implicit criticism of organised religion, and that can't hurt sales, and there's an explicit pro-feminist message and some goddess worship ideology, and ultimately in the Da Vinci Code it's the feminine that saves you. A sense of we've got to get back to the feminine, and taps into the suggestion that the church hasn't treated women rightly. I want to spend a few minutes decoding Da Vinci.
Has the church been lying for 2,000 years? Is this Mary? Did she bear Jesus' child? Has someone guarded this secret for centuries? Is this all news to Jesus?
But more personally and closer to home, what is offered to me by the faith system that's put forward by the Priory of Sion as set out in the Da Vinci Code, and what would I gain or lose by adopting the worldview that Dan Brown proposes, and how does trusting in God through Jesus as portrayed by the Bible differ from what's portrayed in the Da Vinci Code? And what part does truth play in all that? They're big issues. They're not just academic issues, but personal issues. Now, for those who've been living under a rock, I thought I might just give you a little synopsis of what the Da Vinci Code is all about. Harvard professor, his name is Robert Langdon. He gets an urgent call while he's in Paris on business and finds out that the curator of the Louvre has been murdered, and police are baffled by an encoded message left by the dead man that's been written in his own blood, and Langdon follows the trail of this mystery which leads to clues left in the work of Leonardo da Vinci. He joins forces with the cryptologist Sophie Neveu, the curator's granddaughter, and together they discover that the dead curator was part of a secret society, the Priory of Sion. The former members of this society included Isaac Newton, Victor Hugo, Leonardo da Vinci. And behind the scenes there's another organisation, a Catholic lay organisation called the Opus Dei, and they have been plotting to stop the discovery of an ancient secret about the Holy Grail that has been kept hidden by the Priory of Sion for centuries. And if discovered, this secret could shake the foundations of the Christian church, destroy the Christian church, and destroy the faith that it's proclaimed for a couple of millennia. Now, that's Da Vinci Code. Comparison, the movie Saving Private Ryan. In Saving Private Ryan, after leading a company of Rangers in the battle for Omaha Beach on D-Day, Captain John Miller is sent on a mission to find paratrooper Private James Ryan and to bring him home to safety. Ryan's three brothers have all been killed in action, and the American military leaders, the big brass, they want him returned safely to his family. Ryan is fighting in a unit inland, no one knows where. Miller chooses 7 men for this dangerous mission. The squad picked, they make their way across devastated countryside. They lose 2 members in skirmishes with the Germans, and eventually they find Ryan dug in with his unit awaiting a German attack. They say, come home. He says, no, not yet. We've got to have this fight. And he refuses to leave his comrades. And Miller agrees that the squad will stay on to help them defend their position. The Germans, they attack in overwhelming numbers, and Miller and most of the squad are killed, but Ryan survives and makes it home. The genre, the accepted genre, is faction. And when I began to think about the Da Vinci Code, I thought that was the genre that Dan Brown was writing in, factions where the author invents foreground characters, fictional foreground characters, and sets them against a true historical backdrop. So, see, there never was a Private James Ryan. He never existed. Private Ryan didn't exist. There was a private on whom James Ryan was loosely based, a guy called Fritz Nyland. What had happened to Fritz Nyland is 2 of his brothers were killed on Normandy. His other brother was reported missing somewhere in Burma. The army issued an order to bring Private Nyland home, but nobody was sent looking for him because nobody knew where he was, and he was found 2 weeks later unaware of what had happened. And Captain John Miller in Saving Private Ryan, actually Saving Private Ryan finishes with Ryan looking at the grave of John Miller. Captain John Miller, he never existed. He was a fiction character. But the historical background for Saving Private Ryan, that was true. World War II happened. And World War II was England versus Germany. And Normandy exists, and D-Day happened. And was D-Day as bloody and awful as Saving Private Ryan makes out? Yeah, the historians that I've read, they say, yes, it was as bloody and awful as Saving Private Ryan makes out. And there was a Holocaust, and 6 million Jews were killed. But then you get to the end of Saving Private Ryan, and there's a traditional disclaimer. People, characters, and events in this movie are fictitious, and any resemblance to anyone living or dead is entirely coincidental. That's an honesty. There's an honesty there. Private Ryan is fiction. It's fiction with a true historical backdrop. Now, the Vinci Code is fiction. No one is suggesting that there really was an art historian, Robert Langdon. Nobody is suggesting that there really was a French policewoman, Sophie Neveu. No one's suggesting that really was a art buff, Lee Teabing. They're fiction characters, just like Private Ryan. What is being debated is the historical backdrop. And a lot of the Da Vinci Code, a lot of themes in the Da Vinci Code is spent exploring that history, and its theological history, its church history, its Christian history. And when I first read the book, first time I read the book, got on a plane at Manila and read it all the way to Kuala Lumpur, and then all the way from Kuala Lumpur back to Australia. And I was on the plane and thinking, I don't know, that's not right, because I've studied a bit of early church history, and I thought, incident after incident kept jumping out at me, and I was thinking, that's not quite the way it was. And then I thought, no, you've taken a really complex issue here and you've oversimplified it. And I wanted to do this, and I couldn't do it because I was on the plane and there's no stationery shop on the plane. But what I wanted to do was go to a stationery shop and buy 3 highlight pens: a red highlight pen, an orange highlight pen, and a green highlight pen. And what I wanted to do with the highlight pens was take the highlight pens and go through bits of Da Vinci Code and highlight it green, and highlight the things that are certainly true, green. There was a man called Jesus. There was a Last Supper, a night before he died, where he sat down and had dinner with his key followers, and just before he was executed on a bloody Roman cross, and bits that I wanted to highlight green in the backdrop. And then there were bits that I wanted to highlight red, bits that were clearly wrong. I mean, most of the bits in the Da Vinci Code about the 2 central organisations, the Opus Dei and the Priory of Sion, I wanted to highlight red. I'm in the Opus Dei. I got no beef particularly to defend the Catholic Church tonight, but from the research I've done, the Opus Dei is treated very unfairly in the Da Vinci Code. But the errors on the Opus Dei are nothing compared to the errors on the Priory of Sion. For at least the Opus Dei does exist. Whereas the Priory of Sion in the Da Vinci Code, it makes out that this is an organisation that's been stretching back, going back for centuries, and has as its leaders down through the centuries great figures: Leonardo da Vinci, Isaac Newton, Victor Hugo, Charles Debussy, but that's not the case. The Priory of Sion is not some ancient French society stretching back centuries. The Priory of Sion was a society set up by a French conman in 1956. It did not exist before then. And the orange bits, I wanted to highlight some bits orange. That's where a complex issue is so oversimplified that the statements made end up profoundly wrong. I mean, I'll just give you one, I'll give it to you in more detail in a minute or two's time. But the way the four gospel accounts came to be seen as the authoritative accounts of Jesus' life, the Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, it's so oversimplified in the Da Vinci Code. It is much more complex than the way it is portrayed in that novel. But I wasn't that concerned when I read the Da Vinci Code. I mean, I was on a plane, I was reading the book, I was enjoying it, it's a good yarn, it's a story, but as time's gone on, I've found my views firming up. I watched a documentary, I saw Dan Brown interviewed on the documentary, and he says in the documentary that he believes the research that he did, which he's portrayed in this novel, and I got this quote from him. Brown says, "When I started researching the Da Vinci Code, I really was sceptical, and I expected to, at some level, disprove all of this history that's unearthed in this book. But after 3 trips to Paris and a lot of interviews, I became a believer." Dan Brown believes it. And then I discovered this range of literature as I read the Da Vinci Code a second time and noticed a series of books that are quoted in the book, books which when you read them, they don't portray to be fiction, but fact. And then that court case where Brown was portrayed as plagiarising and accused of plagiarising bits of those books. And the Da Vinci Code makes serious claims that Jesus married Mary, claims that Jesus was not God. That's serious. Theological revisionism, historical revisionism. It's like coming along and making the claim that World War II wasn't England versus Germany, but World War II was England versus France. It's changing history, the claims that it's making. It's like saying those killed in the gas chambers, they weren't Jews, they were Germans. The claims it's making are so seriously wrong, they're of that order of magnitude wrong. Now, the problem is, though, that most of us, we don't get our World War II history from reading World War II history books. Most of us, we get our World War II history from Saving Private Ryan. I mean, that's true, isn't it? I mean, when you think, where do you get your World War II? I mean, I was with my wife and Kathy and I, we were out at a dinner party, and we were sitting around in the dinner party, and Kath made the point, yeah, most of the Chinese history I know has come from reading Wild Swans. And one of the ladies at the dinner party said, "You get your Chinese history from reading Wild Swans? That's got so many mistakes in it." Now, I'm no expert on Chinese history. I don't know if Wild Swans is right or not, but I know I saw an error in a newspaper the other day. And it was giving you the background to a story about something, and ultimately I think the error in the newspaper can be traced back to the fact that the writer of the article had read the Da Vinci Code and thought that the history that's been portrayed in the Da Vinci Code was actually right when it isn't. So I want to spend a minute or two just looking back at 1st and 2nd, 3rd century histories, and I want to do it because I think we've got a responsibility to truth. And what I'm going to do is try and show you where some bits are green, some bits are orange, some bits are red. But first I want to pick up on the issues of the feminine. So you see, one of the key scenes in the Da Vinci Code is where the 3 central characters, Langdon, Teabing and Sophie Neveu, they're sitting there in the study. And the men use the Last Supper painting to explain to Sophie the story of the Holy Grail. And they say that the apostle sitting next to Jesus is not the Apostle John, as has been seen in church history, but is in fact feminine Mary Magdalene. And they say down through the centuries, nobody's noticed, but it's a woman, not a man, it's Mary Magdalene. And they say Da Vinci has a message for us. There's a message coming from the Last Supper, and you see the M. The message is the woman at the centre of Jesus' life is capital M, Mary Magdalene. And then they go one step further and they say there's no chalice, no holy cup on the table. The Holy Grail that Indiana Jones was searching for in his last crusade, it's not actually a cup, it's Mary Magdalene. And then they say Mary and Jesus were married, and she was the vessel that held the bloodline of Jesus in her womb, and she bore his children. And down through the centuries, the Grail keepers have been guarding the continuing secret, the bloodline of Christ, the bones of Mary Magdalene. And so Dan Brown claims the quest for the Holy Grail is to kneel before the bones of Mary Magdalene. And then the historian Tebring, he goes on, the concept of woman as a life bringer was the foundation of ancient religion. And childbirth was mystical and powerful, and sadly, Christian philosophy decided to embezzle the female's creative power by ignoring biological truth and making man the creator. And so his thesis is that it really was, who were the founders of Christianity? Jesus and Mary. And then the Apostle Mary was squeezed out by a misogynist church, and now it's an orange issue at this point. I mean, it could be, probably is the case, that Mary Magdalene's had a bit of a rough deal in church history. And I've done a bit of reading, and in some circles I think she's been unfairly portrayed as a prostitute. It wasn't the case, she wasn't a prostitute. But just to come back to the first main question, were Jesus and Mary Magdalene married? No. But it wouldn't bother me if they were. See, sex is a fantastic gift from God. And Catholicism has done us no service by teaching us that sex is all somehow naughty. I believe that Jesus was fully God and fully human, and sex is a very normal human thing to do, and it's good fun. And I've got 3 kids, and it's clearly on the historical record that Jesus had a brother and a mother and sisters, and if Jesus had a wife and kids as well, that wouldn't worry me, but I don't think Jesus was married. Why don't I think Jesus is married? Because if Jesus is married, I think the New Testament would have made it clear. I mean, these documents that are reports on his life, these Matthew, Mark, Luke, John reports on his life, as Jesus is there hanging, dying on the cross, at that moment he looks down at the Apostle John and says, looking after his mother, he says, "John, this is your mother. Look after her when I'm gone." And then he says to his mother, "This is John, he's going to be your son, he's going to look after you." Now, if Jesus was married to Mary Magdalene, he would have said the same thing to her, caringly looking after his wife. And then there's another moment in the early church when the Apostle Paul defends the practice of ministers having wives. And he cites the case of the Apostle Peter and says, look, Peter has a wife. He, the first leader of the Church of Rome, he has a wife, therefore it's okay for ministers to have wives. Well, wouldn't Paul have used the argument Jesus had a wife? If Jesus had a wife? I don't think Jesus had a wife, but I didn't see any problem with him having a wife. Now, the claim that Jesus and Mary were married, it comes from what are called the Gnostic Gospels. And so these 2 historians sitting there in the study, Tebing, Langdon, they show Sophie the Gnostic Gospel of Philip, the Apostle Philip's Gospel. And they say, look, here's the secret. And they give this quote from this Gnostic Gospel. Let me give it to you. And the companion of the Saviour is Mary Magdalene. Christ loved her more than all the disciples and used to kiss her often on her mouth. The rest of the disciples were offended by it and expressed disapproval. They said to him, "Why do you love her more than all of us?" That quote is the closest that any document in ancient history comes to saying that Jesus and Mary Magdalene were married. And that quote that I've just read you is a quote that's printed in the DAVINCI Code. It's an accurate quote from the English translation of the Gospel of Philip. But does that quote mean that Jesus and Mary were married? Well, Sophie's not convinced. She challenges Tebing and said, I don't think that persuades me that they kissed. And Tebing comes back and says, as any Aramaic scholar will tell you, the word companion in those days literally means spouse. Well, I just want to note that an Aramaic scholar might tell you that companion means spouse in Aramaic, but that is completely irrelevant because the only copy of the Gospel of Philip that's ever been found has been written not in Aramaic but in Coptic Greek. It is completely irrelevant what an Aramaic scholar might say. But do you know the Gospel of Philip? What it is when it was written? I mean, when I think gospel, when I hear the expression Gospel of Philip, I think coherent narrative of Jesus' life. But when you read this document, the Gospel of Philip, what is it? It's a collection of pithy sayings. And why is it called the Gospel of Philip? Because he's the only apostle that's mentioned in it. Whereas I'd assume Mark wrote the Gospel of Mark, Matthew wrote the Gospel of Matthew, so the Gospel of Philip must have been written by Philip. That's not the case at all. You just go to Google, type it in, Gospel of Philip, have a read, you'll see that. The Gospel of Philip is as fiction as the DAVINCI Code. And when you read through the Gospel of Philip, you think, oh, some bits are green, some bits are orange, some bits are red. But it raises the whole issue for me of which bits of the New Testament documents, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, are actually raises the issue for me about the New Testament documents, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, how do they come to be, all that kind of thing. See, Teabing, he says in this conversation that the Bible is a product of man, not God, and that history has never had a definitive version of the Bible. Now, that's a very big subject, and I'm about to helicopter over a whole lot of issues that hundreds of PhDs have been written on. Teabing says the Bible didn't arrive by fax from heaven. That's true. Langdon then says the Bible as we know it today was collated by the pagan emperor Constantine, and that's not true. Then Teabing says what Constantine did was commission a new Bible as a bold stroke to unify the Roman Empire, and he could then gather all the people in the Roman Empire around this new religion, Christianity, and he recommissioned all the Bible books, emphasising aspects of Jesus, and that is not true. Now, I remember the question, was Constantine genuinely Christian? Or did he kind of use Christianity to suit his political ends? That was a question that was set for us as a church history course when I was studying church history. It was a good question for our church history class to write an essay on because the answer's not clear. There's arguments on both sides. Was he a genuine Christian or was he a political scheming manipulator? And very hard to work out, and people write books on that subject doing that analysis. And just like people write books about George Bush, saying is he a genuine Christian or was he a scheming manipulator? And how much of George Bush's conversion to Christianity is genuine and how much of Constantine's conversion to Christianity is genuine, and does it suit their political ends? And you may not be a fan of George Bush, and it's not my role to defend him tonight. I've got enough hot potatoes to juggle, but I do think he's had some kind of genuine experience of God. And I do think Constantine had some kind of genuine experience of God, but whatever the genuineness or otherwise of Constantine's conversion, he had nothing to do with the compilation of the New Testament documents. So you look at the New Testament gospel accounts, the Matthew, Mark, Luke, John accounts, and we have this view that the New Testament was written, the Matthew, Mark, Luke, John was written, and then the next thing that was written in Christian literature was C.S. Lewis in 1960. But that's not the case. See, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, they wrote the accounts of Jesus' life, and then a whole lot of other Christian literature came into. Lots and lots of people wrote things. I found the book, Early Christian Writing. It's got account of the letter of Clement. It's got Ignatius. It's got Polycarp. All these different leaders of the Christian church. And how do you decide? Well, which bit should be in the Bible, which bit shouldn't be in the Bible? And people were trying to make that analysis, and a consensus grew. How did it grow? Well, one of the issues was that people started debate, and around the year 150, this man called Marcion came along, and he started talking up a distortion of Christianity. And so in response to him, to rebut him, the leaders of the church defined more accurately what was Orthodox Christianity. And then another bloke comes along, a bloke called Montanus, around AD 190, and there's a further clarification of which books are genuinely the authoritative books of the New Testament and which ones weren't, and basically it didn't change much after that. A little to and froing over the last few books of the Bible, over Hebrews, James, 2, 3, John, Revelation. But there was never a serious proposal not to include Matthew. There was never a serious proposal not to include John or Luke or Mark. And the final reckoning, around 367, Athanasius, the Bishop of Alexandria, wrote down the exact 27 books that we currently have in the New Testament, agreed on by all branches of Christianity. But for Dan Brown to make out that Constantine commissioned a rewriting of the Bible in 325, no reputable scholar believes that. What Brown is saying is not true. It's a lie. It's a distortion. It's an inaccuracy. And it matters. History matters. This is almost an aside, but Dead Sea Scrolls in English. Brown raises the issue of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and he has Teabing say, fortunately for historians, Teabing said, some of the Gospels that Constantine attempted to eradicate managed to survive. The Dead Sea Scrolls were found in the 1950s, hidden in a cave near Qumran in the Judean desert, and of course the Coptic Scrolls in 1945 in Nag Hammadi. And he says, in addition to telling the true Grail story, these documents speak of Christ's ministry in very human terms. I read through the Dead Sea Scrolls, complete Dead Sea Scrolls in English. Brown says these scrolls speak of Christ's ministry in very human terms. The Dead Sea Scrolls not only do not speak of Christ's ministry in human terms, they do not speak of Christ at all. They were written, finalised, completed, cave sealed before Christ was born. The Dead Sea Scrolls are Jewish documents. They show lots of light on Jewish history, but nothing on Christian history. There's nothing in them about Jesus. What about Jesus, you say then? Well, there's a line in the DAVINCI Code that says the divinity of Jesus, whether or not Jesus was God or not. That was voted on by Council of Nicaea, directed by Constantine. I just can't let that go unchecked. So 15 years ago, I pinched a book from my father's bookshelf, Constantine and the Conversion of Europe. I don't think Dad's ever missed it. And it sat on my bookshelf for 15 years until a couple of weeks ago. But there's a very detailed account in this book of the Council of Nicaea, Constantine and the Conversion of Europe. And what happened was the Roman Empire, theologically, they were having a row. And Constantine wanted the bishops in the Roman Empire, 200 or 300 bishops, to sort it out. But the issue they were split on wasn't whether or not Jesus was divine. Now, what was the issue? Well, they're having a debate. There's a bloke called Arius on one side of the debate. And so you've got Arius and his mates and everyone else. So you've got the Arians versus the non-Arians. And the Council of Nicaea was having a debate. And Eusebius, Bishop of Caesarea, he said, let's agree on a statement. And he put up a statement for them to agree on. And he said, here's the statement I reckon we should sign off on. We believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of all things visible and invisible, and in one Lord Jesus Christ, the Word of God, God from God, light from light, life from light. And that motion from Eusebius was warmly received and adopted, and then the debate moved on to the real issue being put forward by Arius. He said, we believe in one Lord Jesus Christ, the Word of God, God from God, only begotten Son, firstborn of all creation, begotten from the Father before all ages, by whom also all things are made. There was a debate, but the debate wasn't over whether or not Jesus was divine. The debate was over how long Jesus had existed for, whether Jesus had been in existence for all eternity, or whether he was created at some later stage. And they had a vote, and Brown says it was close. Well, if 300 to 6 is close, then it was close. The divinity of Jesus was not something foisted on the church 4 centuries after Jesus died and rose again. In John's account of Jesus' life, written in the years immediately after Jesus' death and resurrection, by the man who knew him, loved him, stood at the cross when he died, looked after his mother after he died. What did John write? John wrote opening sentence of his gospel account of Jesus' life. He wrote, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. God in Jesus took on human form. God became flesh. When you look at Jesus, you see God. And we got a tropical fish tank at home. And I think it's probably true. I don't know if you've got a fish tank at home. I don't know if you've thought about this, but I've been thinking about our tropical fish. And I think our tropical fish have very small brains and very short memories. And so I think actually life in the tropical fish tank is very exciting because it's always new experiences, because you've forgotten what happened when you were last up that end of the tank. And so my fish are kind of swimming around in the tank saying, oh, look, there's a rock. And then they swim around again, oh, a rock. Swim around again. Look, a rock. Swim around again. Wow, a rock. And it'd be quite an exciting life being a tropical fish, always seeing new things, new adventures, new places to see. I've been thinking, how could I, as the owner of the tank, communicate with my tropical fish? I, the owner of the tank, the one who owns the tank, who cleans the tank, who fills the tank, who provides food for the tank, who turns on the light, turns on the sun in the morning and turns it off every night. How could I communicate with my tropical fish? The only thing I could do is become a tropical fish. A bit of a shock for me to think of limiting myself to, oh, there's a rock. But that is what God has done. In that what God did, God, the creator of the world, chose to limit himself to becoming human. And this discussion point in the 3rd, 4th century was not over whether or not Jesus was God. That was agreed on. The discussion point was whether or not Jesus had always eternally existed beforehand. No early church historian of any credibility accepts the DAVINCI Code thesis that Jesus' divinity was plonked on an unsuspecting church by a pagan emperor in an astute political move. But the biggest concern for me is that the DAVINCI Code profoundly misses the point of what Jesus actually came to do. So much attention is spent on the Last Supper, this allegedly secret message of Jesus in the M sending to the world. That Dan Brown actually misses the message that Jesus was trying to send to the world. And it wasn't secret, it wasn't hidden, it was absolutely clear. Jesus was trying to send a message to the world, and he was explaining his death the next day. You look at what happened that night, and you read the account of what happened that night, and Matthew, he was there, he wrote, while they were eating, Jesus took the bread, gave thanks, broke it, gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take and eat, this is my body." Then he, Jesus, took the cup, gave thanks and offered it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you. This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." He's saying, remember me. The cup at the focus, the holy grail of the DAVINCI Code. When the disciples of Jesus drank it, they were drinking a metaphor, and it's not a difficult metaphor. See, if I said to you, "This is my son," none of you think that my son is this piece of paper. It's clear that it's a representation of him that's on this piece of paper. You know my son is home in bed, or he's supposed to be. Now, what happened was the very next day, as Jesus has got his arms banged into that cross with nails, the bread was broken, his body was broken. As Jesus' blood pours out the side of his body, his blood is shed. Blood poured out for the forgiveness of sins. God not only became a human in the person of Jesus, but Jesus, who was God, was horribly executed. Honesty moment. The way we've treated God has been appalling. Someone very close to me has just profoundly turned their back on their parents, shut their parents out, excluded them from their life for several years, moved to another part of the planet, refused to answer emails, refused to answer phone calls, and refused to tell them the address that he's living in. That's awful. But that is what you and I have done to God. Again and again, I've taken the good things from God and then ignored him. That's sin. Sin is not breaking rules. Sin is internally, profoundly rejecting God. And how does God deal with it? Well, God doesn't say it doesn't matter. It does matter. It was awful. But what does he do? God comes himself into the tank in the person of Jesus and sheds his blood in our place. And so the night that he's about to die in this Last Supper moment, Jesus says, "This is my blood shed for many, for the forgiveness of sins." In Saving Private Ryan, Captain James Miller is sent to find Private James Ryan. And at the end of the mission, Miller is killed. And Miller is dying on the battlefield. And Ryan runs up to comfort Miller. And this dying man who's come with 6, 7 people to save Ryan looks Ryan in the eye and says, "Earn it." 6, 7 men have died that you might live. Earn it. Ryan survives. He makes it home. And then at the end of Saving Private Ryan, you see Private Ryan visiting the grave of Captain John Miller and reflecting back on those words of this man who died for him. Earn it. What did Jesus say as he died? Jesus didn't say, "Earn it." Jesus said, "My blood's been poured out for the forgiveness of sins. Remember me." Forgiveness is not something we earn from God. Forgiveness is something that is given to us because Jesus pays for it. But that forgiveness cannot, must not, shouldn't be taken for granted. That forgiveness needs to be remembered. So I stand there with the fictitious Private James Ryan looking at a cross that marks the one who died for me, tears flowing down my face, sobbing with gratitude. Now, Saving Private Ryan, there's interesting maths. The American brass decide on high they want to save Private James Ryan. And Captain John Miller and 6, 7 others head off to save him. But then the maths gets difficult because 6, 7 of them die, and John Miller finds it hard because he's working on maths. One life's worth 1 death. And hang on, we've had 6, 7 die for 1 life. And for him it doesn't seem right. But it's even more extraordinary, the maths with Jesus. Because what happens with Jesus is 1 die, so all can be forgiven. How does that work? Well, it can only work if the value of Jesus' person is infinite. It can only work if, as well as being human, Jesus is God. My problem with the DaVinci Code ultimately is that it throws a lot of mud in the air, and most of the mud seems to cover over the issue of who Jesus is and why did he die and what was the significance of his death. Now, if it was badly written mud that nobody read and nobody watched, I wouldn't care. But because it's well written, well read mud throwing, I think it's necessary to answer it. Personal implications. Early in the Da Vinci Code, there's a scene where Silas, the mad, murdering albino monk who's looking for the Holy Grail, smashes open a tile in the floor of a Parisian church, and inside he finds a quote from the Bible. And the quote is, "This far you shall come, but no further." What's happened is all 4 leaders of the Priory of Sion have given him the same clue seconds before he murdered them, and the clue has led them to this church. He's smashed the tile and found the quote, "This far you shall come and no further." He'd been given a false clue. He'd been led up a blind alley and he'd hit a dead end. In the end, the thing that disturbs me most about the Da Vinci Code is that in the end this book is leading people up a blind alley to a dead end. The faith system of the Da Vinci Code is not based in history. And the faith system promoted by the Da Vinci Code doesn't deal with our real need, the basic problem of sin, of rebellion against God. And the Jesus that you meet in the Da Vinci Code is just a slightly above average, but in the end ordinary suburban male who doesn't offer me forgiveness, who doesn't deal with my wrong before God, who doesn't throw open the gates of heaven, and in the end that is not satisfying. It doesn't deal with my need, my real need. I want my relational problem with God to be dealt with, and God has dealt with it in coming to earth in the person of Jesus, and Jesus shedding blood, dying on the cross to allow me to walk into heaven. I don't know why you came tonight. Perhaps you read the book, perhaps you've seen the movie, perhaps you've been thinking through these issues, but if you follow this philosophy, the ideology of the Da Vinci Code, then it leads to a dead end. Freedom, relationship, trust, the knowing the divine, being known by the divine, it can only come from trusting the God who made us, who loved us in Jesus. I, for me, became convinced as a 21-year-old that God in his extraordinary kindness had acted in history to provide a way for the people that he had made who had rebelled against him to come back into relationship with him. And we've written a course, the Introducing God course. And what we've attempted to do in the Introducing God course is to set forward as clearly as I can the account of how God has actually interacted with us in a much more detailed way than I've been able to tonight. The format of the course is much like the format tonight. There's dinner, there's a presentation, then discussion around tables. And it's my hope that if you haven't done that course, that you'd be able to do that course, to see for yourself, past the mud thrown up by the Da Vinci Code, and to meet the real Jesus, the Jesus of history.
Has the church been lying for 2,000 years? Is this Mary? Did she bear Jesus' child? Has someone guarded this secret for centuries? Is this all news to Jesus? Find the truth. ChallengingDaVinci.com.
Introducing God is a chance for you to meet God. It's an 8-week course based around dinner, talks, multimedia and discussion groups.
My own experience, I came into relationship with God, not through an overnight flash, but through discussion, debate, questioning. And so that's really what we've tried to provide in this course. And I think really for many people coming into relationship with God, it's just like coming into any relationship. You don't meet somebody and on the first night decide to marry them.
At the core of the course are the discussion groups, where after listening to a talk, you get to chat, disagree and express your own opinion.
The table discussions, there's kind of no pressure. You can say pretty much anything, and even if you disagree with what Dominic said or anything like that, that's okay, because it's just an opportunity to talk through your ideas with each other.
Everyone having basically different points of view and sharing those points of view and basically being able to talk about God and our relationships.
The man walks into a shop and he's looking for God. Good morning, may I help you? Yes, I was looking for God.
You'll make new friends as you share a meal together each week.
I really like the format, having the meals where you can just sit and chat to people, and then hearing a bit from Dominic and then talking together afterwards. That's been really good.
We saw at the beginning of God's biography that it was God who made the world.
You might expect that a course like this would be pushy, but Introducing God allows you to explore at your own pace.
I definitely found it very threatening, the thought of beginning this course, because of what I'd been exposed to with religion before, in the way of it being pushy. But I found it hasn't been like that. Introducing God has been very laid back. It's never been about an ultimatum. It's always been your own decisions.
And the Jesus we're going to meet is actually very different to the picture that many people have of him.
And you never know. When you meet God, you might actually like him.
My relationship with God is in the early stages still. I'm just feeling around and seeing kind of what's out there and getting to know him more.